She was murdered. What else could it have been? I don't think she ever killed herself.
It was a murder that was designed to look like a suicide.
I can see her getting more and more depressed, losing track of time. 1 pill, 2 pills, 3 pills.
Marilyn was happier than she's ever been outside of those little things like Bobby.
Bobby Kennedy was supposedly in town.
And that would lead to the conclusion that Miss Monroe was murdered.
That is very nice. You're coming out of my apartment. All the garbage men, when I come out of the door, they say, Marilyn! Hi! How do you feel this morning? You know, to me it's an honor. And working men, you know, when they whistle, they think, oh, it's a girl, she's got blonde hair, she's not out of shape. And then it says, my God, it's Marilyn Monroe!
This is the Los Angeles Police Department. What do you need, sir?
At 3 a.m., Miss Murray broke a bedroom window, found the actress dead in bed.
Around 5 o'clock on the morning of August 5th, I got a phone call from Joe Himes, a journalist for the Herald Tribune, who told me that Marilyn had just killed herself and wanted me to go with him to her house and take a camera. And I said that I didn't do those kind of pictures.
According to witnesses, Marilyn was found at about 3 a.m. But the first police officer on the scene, Sergeant Jack Clemens, had only been informed at 4:25 a.m. Why was the call made so late, and after waiting so long? The housekeeper, Eunice Murray, said, "We were talking amongst ourselves." Marilyn's close friend, Patricia Newcomb, gave the same answer. The doctors agreed, there's no doubt, it's suicide. But Sergeant Clemens did not agree and protested. Nobody listened, and he was fired from the force. The mystery of Marilyn begins, and the blanket covering the legendary body is the first to veil the truth that will be concealed for over 20 years.
We followed the station wagon with her body in it to a mortuary on off Wilshire Boulevard in West Los Angeles. And I saw them wheel the body into a very small closet, and it turned out. And I couldn't understand why they were putting the body into a closet that contained a drafting table and a dust broom and some stuff like that. And I took a picture of Marilyn in that closet. This is that picture.
At the Los Angeles Justice Building close to Hollywood, suicide is not an uncommon event. But on this occasion, the coroner waits 13 days before announcing his verdict. The press is curious. Is there really a Marilyn affair to investigate? The names of the Kennedys are mentioned, and silence reigns once more.
It is my conclusion that the death of Marilyn Monroe was caused by a self-administered overdose of sedative drugs, and that the mode of death is probable suicide.
Marilyn's death triggered a shockwave of emotion around the world. But it was not an actress that was mourned, but a myth. Her fans believed it was suicide. Nobody thought she had been murdered. The investigation was reopened in 1982, but not for long. 30 days later, the judges closed the case without a word. Among the new investigators was the Irish author of an acclaimed work on the assassination of John Kennedy. His name was Anthony Summers, and he was an expert in American politics. He was not particularly interested in Hollywood, but he sensed the presence of a major scandal.
Marilyn Monroe came into my life in the most curious way. and was in London and was talking with a colleague of mine who was the senior editor of a major London newspaper. And we were discussing the fact that in Los Angeles, the local authorities, the district attorney's office, had reopened the probe into the death of Marilyn Monroe 20 years after the fact. I mean, this was a bizarre. And one of the very first things that I found, to my astonishment, was that nobody who knew what they were doing, knew how to marshal facts and really delve into the matter, had looked properly into her death. No wonder there was a mystery about her death. It had never been properly reported. The heart of the mystery was the time of night at which she had been found apparently dead. The official or accepted version was that she'd been found at 3:40 a.m. in the morning. But I found myself talking to a very credible witness who had been interrupted during a concert with her husband at the Hollywood Bowl, Henry Mancini was playing that night, by a message that they had to go to a telephone quickly because Marilyn Monroe was dead.
This day I was at a concert at the Hollywood Bowl with Mr. and Mrs. Mervyn Leroy and my husband Arthur Jacobs. And in the middle of the concert, they received, somehow a situation that an emergency had arisen. He got up and left. It was not even halfway through the concert. So I would assume it was about 9 or half past 9 in the evening.
The deputy public prosecutor who attended the autopsy in the old Justice Building confirmed the suicide hypothesis. What are his thoughts today?
We examined her body and found no needle mark whatsoever. So it can be ruled out that the barbiturate that killed her was administered by means of a hypodermic injection. The toxicologist found a 13% reading of the barbiturate in her liver, so that from the time she began absorbing the Nembutal until the time that she died, there was an appreciable period of time, probably not less than an hour or two. How did the barbiturate get into her? The capsule has a yellow dye on opening the stomach. There was no dye stain. One of the findings at the autopsy was that the lower portion of the colon, which is the large intestine, was discolored. It was a deep purplish color. If by means of the barbiturate coming through the use of an enema, the medical facts would be satisfied. And that would lead to the conclusion that Miss Monroe was murdered.
Murder Marilyn? Why? The first trap, occupational hazards.
I loved to play. I didn't like the world around me too much because it was kind of grim. I loved playing with the children in the neighborhood, running out and playing. We could imagine anything and pretend anything. But then, you grow up and you find out they make playing very difficult for you.
Her last film, Something's Got to Give, produced by Fox, ended in disaster, and she was at war with the Hollywood moguls.
So my feeling at the time was that she was just a big annoyance to a lot of people, and she was a big annoyance to me, and I hated to work with her because she was so unthinking, unfeeling, she was so unkind, she was so stupid. She was just very boring to me. The situation between 20th Century Fox and Marilyn Monroe was very tense at the time, and they were looking to get out of their contract with her because she had cost them an enormous amount of money by walking out of, or the studio having to shut down the film Something's Got to Give. And that almost never happens in Hollywood, where a movie's abandoned. But they had simply had enough of her.
And this is the day that she took all her clothes off on the movie Something's Got to Give.
Lowry Schiller considered Marilyn as a partner, not as a friend. But with an artist's sensitive perspective, he was concerned for his model and recognized her failings.
She was always in danger, Marilyn, because she was always trying to make some other person happy or satisfied, and therefore she became weak, she became insecure, and she would take pills. She was going to see her psychologist, Greenson, all the time. Even the psychologist had put a housekeeper nurse into the house, Mrs. Murray. Therefore, she was surrounded by people that were her friends, but also were spies. She didn't even have, what should one say, the right type of pillow to sleep with. What I'm saying is, I don't mean physically a real pillow. I'm saying she didn't have somebody she could put her arms around and go to sleep with. And to somebody like Marilyn Monroe, who wanted a child, that was very, very important.
The second trap, the Kennedy clan. The man of Marilyn's dreams was John Kennedy. As America's first Catholic president, it was his duty to embody the nation's moral and family values. And yet, this hero had been elected with the vital support of a well-known gangster, Sam Giancana, and close and costly links had been formed. He also had a weakness for women. His own brother-in-law, the actor Peter Lawford, supplied a steady stream of mistresses.
She had been swimming in dangerous waters, you might say, in 1962 and earlier. She had become intermittently close, in a bedroom way, to the President of the United States, Jack Kennedy. That is a dangerous place to be in terms of possible exposure for the President. She had also been close to the Attorney General of the United States, and that was a dangerous area too.
The FBI kept a constant watch on Lawford's house. His best friend, Frank Sinatra, held riotous parties here, where Giancana's killers rubbed shoulders with showbiz stars and politicians. Why did Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, accept an invitation to dinner at this Crooks hangout in October 1961?
About midnight, Marilyn wanted her car, and Bob happened to be standing nearby and noticed and saw that she was quite drunk. And he said, "You can't drive, and I'll drive you home." And then he said to somebody to get me, get Ed Guthman. And they found me in another part of the house, and I came, and we took her home and carried her into her house and put her to bed. She called him a lot after that first meeting.
In May 1962, John Kennedy invited Marilyn to New York for his birthday. 20th Century Fox were against the trip, but Marilyn gave in to temptation. It was a serious mistake. Her tryst with JFK should have remained a secret, but the world's cameras zoomed in on them.
So much. Who has done more?
It was another trap. Was Marilyn aware of the risks and of the outcome of a potential scandal? Absolutely not. At that very moment, her thoughts were elsewhere. Just 1 month before she died, she told a journalist, "That night, I was terrified of losing my voice. What if no sound came out? That was my only obsession." For the first time, the Kennedys authorized their personal hairdressers to work with Marilyn. She tried to manipulate him.
When I met Marilyn for the second time, I was called by her secretary, and I was asked to come up to the house. And she didn't want me to do her hair. She wanted me to give her some information in the White House and who was coming and who, was coming in and out. And I knew that I couldn't give out any information. And then I got a call from Bobby Kennedy, in which he said, "Oh, so you're always protecting the Kennedys." And I thought that was very strange, and I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I heard your conversation with Marilyn." And I was totally shocked. I said, "How could you do that?"
John Kennedy has other worries. The situation in Cuba is increasingly critical. The Cold War with Khrushchev is at its height, and the Berlin Wall splits Germany in two. The Russians win the first leg of the space race with Gagarin, but the US soon responds with Shepard. In Nevada, nuclear testing goes on unabated as the fear of nuclear war grips the whole world. In this tense climate, FBI boss J. Edgar Hoover believes the president is taking unnecessary risks. He advises Kennedy to keep a distance from his mistresses, and the order is given to put a stop to the pillow talk.
We now know that from a quite early date in 1962, J. Edgar Hoover was taking an interest in what the Kennedys were doing with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe had been to Mexico. She had spent time socializing and talking with American left-wingers and indeed some American communists, and because they were being watched and surveilled, Marilyn Monroe was watched with them. And as a result, this lovely, funny actress became, to the FBI, Marilyn Monroe security risk.
Running wild, lost control, running wild, mighty bold, feeling gay, reckless too, carefree mind all the time, never blue.
These documents, which my lawyer and I obtained after years of applying to the FBI for anything they had on Marilyn Monroe, moved the story immediately into a completely different category, from a scandal story about the death of Marilyn Monroe and her possible sex activity with the Kennedy brothers, into the area of a serious espionage story. And this is new.
Anthony Summers' lawyer, James Lazar, is a seasoned campaigner for the freedom of information. It took him 4 years of persistent and subtle wrangling to get into the FBI's files.
The documents in Marilyn Monroe's 105 file is a classification number that the FBI gives to subjects that concern foreign counterintelligence. It has a -C, which means that the nature of it concerns communism.
To consult the archives, Lazar had to follow a bizarre ritual. He was locked in a small room opposite an FBI agent. Each of them had a file. Lazar's was censored, the agent was intact. The lawyer asked questions, and the agent consulted his papers like playing cards. James Lazar had to make do with a word-of-mouth report.
In the spring and summer of 1962, the FBI had received information about conversations that Marilyn Monroe apparently had with either John or Robert Kennedy, and they discussed sensitive matters such as the morality of nuclear testing and Fidel Castro's Cuba.
At the end of July, Marilyn was fighting Fox with the support of her photographer friends. The idea of a press conference was raised. She has just 10 days to live.
It was only a couple of weeks before Marilyn died that we came here at the beach and we took pictures of her that we'll remember for the rest of my life. This was her favorite playground. She came here as a little girl with her mother and her friends. When she went to junior high, this is where she and her friends came and had fun. And in her last days, she came here. And not far from here was the Peter Lawford house. And when she looked over that way, she had sort of misty eyes, because here is where she met John F. Kennedy. And here he was, relaxed, away from the hardships and the frustrations of Washington, D.C. And he could sit and relax with Marilyn and have fun. His brother the same. And Marilyn was so happy here.
The third trap, the Mafia. Marilyn is still hoping to see the Kennedys again and accepts an invitation to the Cal Naval Lodge on the border of California and Nevada. It is a rather unusual hotel owned by her old friend Frank Sinatra, built on the edge of Lake Tahoe in the 1920s as a casino. The lodge is a veritable mob hideout, with a secret tunnel dating back to Prohibition, and criminals on the run still find refuge here. But it's mainly used by Sinatra and Marilyn's lovers as a safe place to visit incognito. Numerous witnesses have confirmed the presence of John and Robert Kennedy here.
At the Calneva Lodge, Marilyn did not have a good time, she told me. She said that Giancana was after her, trying to, you know, have sex with her, and he was just this ugly old man with stinky socks or what, I don't know. And she said that Frank wasn't paying attention to her, and then I think she told me that DiMaggio was hanging around, stalking her. Basically, she had a lousy time. And I said, told you so.
Sinatra is omnipresent in this affair, with Giancana and the Mafia, with the Kennedys and political power, and with Marilyn, Lawford, and their depression. He sets up the various meetings, often not knowing when to stop. In 1998, former Hollywood film editor Don Wolfe made the headlines with an investigative book which revealed some startling new elements. The book was entitled The Assassination.
One of the most mysterious weekends in Marilyn Monroe's life was her last weekend, the Calneva weekend that took place at the end of July of 1962. She had flown up on Frank Sinatra's airplane at Sinatra's invitation, and it turned out to be a gathering of the Klan, so to speak. And what they were really trying to do was talk Marilyn out of holding her press conference and trying to persuade her to forget about the Kennedys and go on with her life.
No comment.
Sam Giancana had been there that weekend, and it was also being persuasive in trying to keep Marilyn quiet.
When Frank returned from Calneva, he asked me if I would develop the film myself and not let anybody else see it. And I developed the film, and I saw Marilyn on all fours. There were about 9 frames of film. She was quite sick. She looked sick, and astride her, either riding her like a horse or trying to help her up, I couldn't tell which, was Sam Giancana. Frank asked me what I thought he should do with them. I said I would burn them. He took out his lighter, burned them, and that was the end of it.
When Marilyn returned in Sinatra's plane from Calneva, they landed at the Santa Monica airport, and there was a driver there that was waiting to pick up Marilyn and Lawford, and he remarked in an interview that Marilyn seemed to be drugged, that she got off the plane, she wasn't wearing her shoes, and she seemed to be very unsteady on her feet. And he said that on the way back to Lawford's beach house, when he was driving Lawford home, that Lawford had him stop by a payphone, and Lawford was on the phone for about 20 minutes, and the driver said he couldn't understand why he couldn't wait and place the call when he got to his house, which was only 5 minutes away. Well, in the Kennedy Library, you'll see a telephone log of Peter Lawford calling Jack Kennedy that early morning.
When Marilyn recovered, she obtained a new contract with Fox, who doubled her salary. She was also planning new projects with George Barris, and had just 6 days left alive.
When I was in New York, after I left Los Angeles and Marilyn Monroe, I was putting together the story for Cosmopolitan magazine, which was to be about 12 pages, and the cover. She called me on a Friday afternoon, and she asked me, how is everything going? I said, fine. She said, George, you must come back to see me in California. I have some very important things we have to talk about. It's very important. I said, Marilyn, it's Friday here. I says, I'll try to come out by Monday morning if it's all right. She says, please, promise me. I says, I promise I'll come out.
Barris was blissfully unaware that he would soon receive a priceless cinema treasure. These few seconds of 8mm home movies filmed by a passing tourist was the last footage taken of Marilyn alive. The final day, Saturday, August the 4th. At 8 a.m., Marilyn woke up tense and tired after several anonymous phone calls. Who was it? The voice sounded like an ominous countdown.
I had a phone call from her about 9 in the morning, She said that she couldn't get in touch with Bobby or Jack or anyone, and she was very distraught. She said, they've just tossed me aside like an old shoe. And I said, well, maybe, you know, maybe things are getting hot, maybe their wives are finding out, and just cool it for a while. She got very angry. She said, no, I'm not cooling it. She said, I'm going to talk on Monday, I'm going to call the press, and I'm going to talk about what bastards they are.
At 9 o'clock, the witnesses to the approaching drama began to arrive. Patricia Newcomb spent the night here. She would never say a single word. Eunice Murray, who claimed to have found the body at about 3 a.m., but who would later change her story. At 9:30, her son-in-law Norman Jeffries, the handyman, arrived. Don Wolfe found him 30 years later, a sick man, ready to confess.
One of the key witnesses to Marilyn's death was Norman Jeffries, who was called the handyman. He had worked at Marilyn's house for several months, and he was actually the son-in-law of Eunice Murray, Marilyn's housekeeper. There are photos of Norman in the local newspapers that Sunday morning after Marilyn's death when the police arrived, and he was one of the key witnesses to the events that took place. Yet there was no police interview of Norman, and none of the journalists had ever interviewed him.
Don Wolfe made a recording of Norman Jeffries. The tape is inaudible, and the witness asked to stop the recording at certain key moments.
Then, now here's where I want the recorder on. Okay.
What Norman told me I found to be quite astounding. It proved that he had been a key witness to all the events that had taken place. And what he said was that Marilyn had fired his mother-in-law, Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, that morning, and he was helping Eunice pack her belongings when Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford arrived about mid-afternoon. He said it was at about 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon. And Eunice and Norman were told to leave. They were given some money by Lawford and told to go to the market, but the message was clear that they were to get out of there. He said they returned about an hour later, saw that Lawford's car was gone, and when they returned to the house, they found Marilyn in a very hysterical state. He said he had never seen anybody that upset, and that Marilyn was both angry and frightened, and said that she had been threatened by Bobby Kennedy.
I've heard people say that he was in Los Angeles that night, and it's really ridiculous. We went to San Francisco. He had a friend, Mr. Bates, that had a ranch down at Salinas. And he and Ethel and the 4 children went to Salinas on a Friday and stayed over. And on Sunday afternoon, came back to San Francisco. We met in San Francisco that evening. And
the alibi does not hold up. Goodman was not with Robert Kennedy that weekend.
He was in Los Angeles, yes. We don't know whether he went to her house. We don't know that at all. No one knows that. And he certainly didn't admit it. As a matter of fact, he indicated he was in San Francisco. We happen to know he was in Los Angeles, but we don't know what he did that day. He could have certainly been there. He was the Attorney General of the United States. He could have been there on an investigation, and we didn't follow him. We just knew he came into the airport.
Is it not strange that there were no police present when the Attorney General left? Particularly as Inspectors Jerry McGee and James Ahern always protected Robert Kennedy when he was in Los Angeles. We tried to find them, but one of them is dead, and the other remains silent. Almost a dozen witnesses have certified to Anthony Summers that Marilyn Monroe's house was bugged. Summers believes them, and he is a hardened professional, but he has never seen or heard a single tape.
I was impressed that when I talked to the technicians that were being used in connection with the bugging, and some had not talked to each other for many years, and I tracked them down, that their accounts of what they knew of the reception on the bugs was consistent one with the other. And he said that Robert Kennedy came to see Monroe and that they made love that afternoon. But then began a violent argument in which there was an outburst in which Marilyn Monroe said, "I feel passed around. I feel passed around like a piece of meat," presumably from brother to brother. "You've lied to me. Get out of here. I'm tired of it. Leave me alone." And that Kennedy then left.
Norman Jeffries said that they had called Dr. Greenson, who lived nearby, Marilyn's psychiatrist, who came by and calmed Marilyn down, that he was with her for about 2 hours, and had asked Norman and Eunice to stay on that evening and look after Marilyn.
Joe Nahr had been invited to the Lawfords for dinner that night, but his invitation was cancelled, perhaps because of a surprise guest.
Peter called and said, I'm sorry to bother you, but I just talked to Marilyn, and she sounds like she's really on drugs, and I'm frightened. Would you go check and see if she's okay? And I forgot to mention that I lived 4 blocks from her, and I was the closest. And it was very important that Peter didn't show up himself. But it wasn't even that. He just thought it was, she had done this before, and he just wanted to make sure that she was all right.
So what stopped Lawford going to help Marilyn? According to certain witnesses, Robert Kennedy was there in the house until at least 10 p.m. There would therefore be no question of Lawford receiving guests, even less of visiting Marilyn's home.
The last call Marilyn made to me, she was more or less pleading for pills. The first one, she was asking. The second one, she was more or less pleading for pills because she wanted to go to sleep. She didn't want to hear this voice again. And I said, Marilyn, I can't come over. I can't. I'm drunk. So I went to sleep, and then, I don't know when, but after I went to sleep, I heard the phone ring, and I didn't answer it.
Why did she want pills? She had plenty of pills. She was surrounded by doctors who prescribed an endless supply. 6 different medicines would be found later.
And Norman said that at about 10 o'clock that night, that Bobby Kennedy returned with 2 men he didn't recognize. Again, they were asked to leave, and he said, when the Attorney General is standing at the front door and you're told to leave the premises, there's no question about what you're supposed to do.
This time, he remembered Robert Kennedy was saying something like, we have to know, we have to know. We must know, it's important to the family. We can make any arrangements you want, but we must find it. Must find something. I've wondered whether that he was looking for a bugging device or for a tape recorder. But anyway, he was looking for something. And then there was apparently a clack, 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 clack on the tapes, which sounded to the ear like hangers being pushed along a rail. Again, perhaps as if somebody was looking for something in the closet. And then he said, then there was a flopping sound, maybe books being turned over, that kind of a noise. Sometimes the tape was clear, sometimes it wasn't. And then Lawford was heard saying, calm down, calm down. And Monroe was screaming at the 2 of them and ordering Lawford and Kennedy out of the house. And then he said there were sort of thumping, bumping noises and muffled calming sounds, calming her down. And he said he thought, given where she was found later, that maybe they were helping her onto the bed, putting her onto the bed. No suggesting that they were hitting her or anything, just that they were calming her, and there were bumps and sounds like maybe they were carrying her about. And then he said the final portion of the recording was a conversation between Bobby Kennedy and Lawford about Kennedy getting back to where he was staying in Northern California that weekend and how he was going to get there, and making an arrangement, which is that a telephone call would be made to Monroe's number after Kennedy had left the area. And then there was a sound on the tape of a telephone ringing and being picked up, and then nothing.
Norman said that when they returned to the house, they found Marilyn comatose on the bed in the guest cottage, which was a separate structure, and they thought that she was dead, that the cast of her skin was blue. She didn't seem to be breathing, but they did call an ambulance. Before the ambulance arrived, Norman said he had gone to the gate to open the gate, and Pat Newcomb, Marilyn's press agent, and Peter Lawford arrived minutes before the ambulance. And when it did arrive, they tried to resuscitate Marilyn. And my second key witness that I spoke to, James Hall, the ambulance driver, said that they had moved her body from the daybed to the floor, tried to resuscitate her, and Dr. Greenson arrived during the resuscitation process and told them to remove the resuscitator and give her what he called positive pressure. So they tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but she was in the process of succumbing. Her pulse was failing, and Dr. Greenson pulled out what's called a heart needle from his medical bag and tried to revive Marilyn with a shot of adrenaline into the heart, but the needle hit a rib, and he said Marilyn succumbed shortly after they had removed the resuscitator, and that was at about 10:45 that Saturday evening.
Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, is of course a pivotal figure in the story, and some terrible things have been written about him behind his back in death, to the huge upset of his family, some of them suggesting that he was the terrible man who arrived with a hypodermic needle and killed her on the spot. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever for that. But it's also clear that he did not tell the whole truth about the events of that night. He said in an interview on the telephone when he was in a hurry with a journalist, and I've heard the tape recording of that interview, he said, "Look, I can't explain or defend myself without revealing things that I don't want to reveal. It's a terrible position that I'm in. I can't talk about it. I just can't tell the whole story." And the reporter talking to him then brought up the name of Bobby Kennedy, and he said, "Well, ask Bobby Kennedy," and hung up the phone.
Dr. Engelberg still refuses to talk about Robert Kennedy and the night of August the 4th. And yet he was present and confirmed the official declaration that Marilyn died at 3 o'clock in the morning. But we know now, thanks to Mrs. Jacobs, that Marilyn died well before midnight. But that's the way this story goes. From the start, everything was faked. Evidence disappeared, the witnesses lied, and the truth was blatantly concealed. Marilyn's last surviving neighbor still lives close to the scene of the drama. He saw many things that night, which we'll not discuss.
Occasionally you do interviews.
I don't do interviews, and I very even speak about something about that.
According to several books, you attested to the police that at a certain point after coming back from a party, you saw a police car and an ambulance.
Some cars and an ambulance, that's all I saw, and we went in and came to the house, and that's all it was.
And what time was it about that you came?
Close to 12 o'clock, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Patrolman Lynn Franklin was on duty that night and was in for the surprise of his life.
I was working a solo unit out of Beverly Hills Police. I came on duty at 12 midnight, and as I approached Olympic Boulevard, I spotted a Lincoln Continental doing about 70 miles an hour eastbound on Olympic Boulevard in a 25-mile zone. I threw on my red light and siren and finally got the car stopped right here at the curb, which is a mile away. I walked up to the car, recognized Peter Lawford, whom I'd known for years, driving. Seated in the back seat was Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and there was another man in the front seat with Peter Lawford. I asked Peter why he was driving so fast. He said he was trying to get the Attorney General to the Hilton Hotel to get up and pick up his luggage. He had to leave town. And I said, well, Peter, you're 2 miles beyond the turnoff point for the Hilton Hotel. And at that time, the Attorney General said, "You stupid ass," referring to Peter Lawford.
Robert Kennedy and his escort raced into the night. Were they heading for the airport? A few days later, Billy Woodfield tried to pick up the trail. Fortunately, he knew a pilot.
And his log showed that on Saturday night at around 10:30, he got a phone call from Peter Lawford to come to the beach house and pick up Bobby Kennedy and take him to the Los Angeles International Airport, presumably for a flight, the notes show, for a flight, a United Airlines flight to Northern California, to San Francisco.
It was in an office building where Pat Newcomb was and Arthur Jacobs, and all the telephones were ringing, and there were 3 or 4 other people in suits and ties, and I don't know who they were. It was panic. Pat Newcomb was crying, and Arthur Jacobs was trying to, control her. The most important thing is they were trying to figure out what to do with the funeral. Sinatra was on the phone. Phones were ringing, people were talking. It was dark. It was in the middle of the night. It was a very difficult moment for lots of people.
John Miner is very clear about how the investigation was carried out.
The first person being present was a sergeant of the Los Angeles Police Department who himself, because he had a preconceived idea that she committed suicide and therefore there was nothing to investigate, failed to declare the Monroe residence in Brentwood a crime scene. And if the residence had been declared a crime scene, everything that has happened in this case would be different. The house would be sealed. An inventory would be made of everything in the house. Everything would be dusted for fingerprints. The equipment that was used to give her the fatal enema would have been found, and there would have been traces of the barbiturate in that equipment.
We submitted the autopsy report to the Anti-Poison Center in Paris. The specialist's conclusions are staggering.
The equipment for administering an enema was not found, which obviously may mean she wasn't given an enema. But it doesn't rule out an injection via the rectum, because in the same way, no glass was found with which she could have absorbed the pills or ingested the powder from capsules she'd opened. When we look at the list of medicines that were analyzed, we can observe one thing to begin with, that the police reports indicated that around her bed were about 15 bottles of different medicines, but later, at the coroner's, there were only 8. And among these 8 were a certain number which contained psychotropic drugs, which could lead to consciousness problems and participate in the onset of coma. Most of the packages were empty, and the toxicological analysis only focused on 2 substances, whereas there were several others which could have been responsible for unconsciousness and participated in the acute poisoning. There was a hypnotic tranquilizer, which is Noludar, of which the main ingredient is methylprilene, and there was a bottle of 50 capsules near the bed which was empty. These were probably consumed, at least in part, by Marilyn Monroe, but no analysis was made.
Donc il avait probablement été au moins en partie consommé par Marilyn Monroe. Il n'y a pas eu d'analyse de fait.
Assassination is a possibility. I'm not sure it's the easiest way, the simplest manner of killing someone. If you force someone to absorb drugs by administering them via the rectum, it would appear to me to be very complicated, and you would at least need some kind of complicity within the household.
It is known and admitted that her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was operating a washing machine at midnight after the death of her mistress. Why? Well, it seems reasonable that some fluid and perhaps fecal matter had escaped during the administration of the barbiturate enema. And there's a reasonably good chance then that the discolored colon and the congestion were the product of the way in which the barbiturate came in to Miss Monroe's body.
And down the years, Mrs. Murray, who was a very sharp lady, very sharp when I first interviewed her, who remembered all sorts of other things with great clarity, extraordinary. You couldn't believe she was so old. But when it came to the events of that night, suddenly she blurred and her voice drifted off and she said she couldn't remember. And she suddenly put her, I can still see her, she put her head in her hands and she said, "Mr. Summers, why do I still have to cover all this up?" And I said, "What, cover what up?" And then she proceeded to sit there and tell me that Robert Kennedy had been to the house that day, and she said that there'd been an ambulance that came that night, And I said, but why didn't you tell the police that? And she said, because I told whatever seemed good to tell. And I said, but why did it seem good to tell? Why was the correct story not told? And she said, well, it was sticky. It became so sticky that the protectors of Robert Kennedy had to step in there and protect him.
The funeral arrangements were taken over by Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn's second husband.
Everybody in Hollywood, Sinatra, all of this group, wanted to give a funeral for the world. And in his mind, that would make her a greater actress. But when DiMaggio was told that she had died the next day, and he came directly to LA, he walked in, he was strong. Nobody was going to monkey with Frank Sinatra except Joe DiMaggio. And he said, no, this is going to be a private thing. She was a private person. She doesn't belong to the world. She belongs to those people that loved her and cared for her and took care of her. And that's why DiMaggio had a small, simple funeral. And you can see in this picture the pain and the suffering. You can see the pain. If this was Frank Sinatra walking, he wouldn't see the pain.
Our investigation rules out the suicide theory. The alternatives are murder or medical error. The murder theory is laid out here in its most radical version by a former secret agent working for the LAPD who read a secret file on Marilyn Monroe where he discovered the motive for murder. A motive so outrageous he could hardly believe it.
Years later, many years later, when I was researching some other information, I gathered some intelligence reports from the Central Intelligence Agency and some other intelligence agencies, and to my surprise when I was reading it, here I found an intelligence document written by the CIA regarding this conversation President Kennedy had with Marilyn Monroe. And at that time, along with other documents I obtained, I realized that this was confirmation that he was in fact telling her the truth about this event. And when I realized that, I was shocked. And it actually made me nervous because it's such a phenomenal event. It would literally change the world. It potentially could change the world. When I read the report and got to the point where I saw that Marilyn was no longer speaking, and these other men, whoever they were, in the house and potentially moving her body around, I realized at that moment in time that she probably did not commit suicide. It was a murder that was designed to look like a suicide. So then questions started running through my mind, well, why would they do this? Why would anybody do this? What could she know that would be so damaging that a government agency would kill her? And then it finally jogged in my mind again what I had previously read about some of the conversations she had with John Kennedy and the significance of this one particular event. And I thought, my God, that would be a reason to kill somebody. And I think anybody who would come forward with the information runs a very real risk of facing the same demise that Marilyn did.
It's now known that the Kennedys planned sending an anonymous bomber to destroy China's nuclear sites. Was this the world-changing secret? It's a valid premise, but once again there is no proof except for a few documents in the Kennedy Library confirming the existence of such a project. Our conclusion is rather more down to earth. There were simply too many doctors attending to Marilyn. It was an accident waiting to happen. 1 year after the tragedy, Billy Woodfield wanted to find out the truth and decided to interview the psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson.
My question was really a very simple one. I wanted to know why he had prescribed, or the doctors had prescribed, chloral hydrate for a depressed and suicidal patient when Materia Medica absolutely recommends against it. Especially someone who drinks, because chloral hydrate and alcohol become knockout drops, but it only increases depression. And Greenson said that he and Engelberg had gotten their signals crossed and that they had really messed it up. And as a matter of fact, he said, we are responsible for her death. We killed her.
In our view, we have to believe the doctors. Dr. Engelberg and Dr. Greenson did not do their job. And so Marilyn Monroe died from a tragic medical accident. So why does the mystery live on? Because Robert Kennedy was there. All traces of his visit had to be eliminated. But those involved panicked, and the resulting mess had to be concealed. As a result, the death of Marilyn Monroe became an American state secret.
Gee, happiness wasn't anything I ever took for granted. Just for instance, it's not just that, okay, fame will go by. You know, so long I've had you, fame. If it goes by, I told you it was fickle. So at least it's something that, let's say, I experienced.